If Russia's plan in Ukraine really is to demilitarize the nation, it's not working. I mean, it could have, but that time has long since passed. If we look back at Putin's stated goals at the start of the invasion, he said part of the goal of the special military operation was the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. Whenever the slow Russian progress on the battlefield or their loss of captured territory around Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Kherson are brought up, this is what folks point to. They say occupation or the taking of territory has never been the goal, but rather the elimination of the Ukrainian military. And I mean, Putin even said that. Quote, our plans do not include the occupation of Ukrainian territories. I'm not sure I buy that. Between an attempted run on the capital in the first days of the war to the annexation of territories in the east and the south, Russia's actions don't exactly line up with Putin's initially stated goals. The challenge, and this gets into an information warfare piece that I'll talk to in a bit, is that Russia has very vaguely defined success in this war. So much so that they're able to pretty effectively shift the goalpost to where really anything is them moving in the right direction. Now, physical progress on the battlefield is pretty easily tracked. There's free mapping programs like Live UA Map, Deep State Map, Institute for the Study of War, and others that give very detailed views on where the current line of contact sits. On top of that, there's a flood of everyday people on Twitter and Telegram doing some really impressive work geolocating media that comes off the battlefield. I can't tell you how many times I've seen an image presented as evidence of one side's advance, only to be met with a dozen accounts bringing proof to show that claim isn't actually correct. It's happened on both sides, and honestly, every single time I see one of those, I'm impressed with just how good people are at that sort of investigative work. But anyways, progress on the battlefield is something that's easy to confirm or deny, and it's a data point being used in the argument that Russia is failing. But focusing on demilitarization relies on data that really nobody can agree on. I mean, in terms of equipment, Oryx probably has the most robust accounting out there, but they've even been called out for errors, which is going to happen. They've got a massive, never-ending database they're working with based on blurry photos and 2-second videos. It's impressive what they put together, and I don't mean to knock it at all. Simply that some of the best publicly available information on this front, we already know isn't 100% accurate. On the Russian side, their Ministry of Defense puts out daily updates that includes a rolling summary of destroyed Ukrainian equipment, but we can't really rely on this with any confidence. Just too many times they've claimed more equipment has been destroyed than Ukraine ever possessed. It's just a crapshoot using that for any sort of data analysis at this point. Casualties are even more heavily debated. You can pretty easily find a source to back up whatever you want to believe on the casualty front. Whether you think they're somewhat equal or heavily skewed in one direction or another, that analysis is out there somewhere. Honestly, you can find pretty reliable sources wildly out of whack with one another when it comes to their casualty estimates. I mean, you don't even have to dip into the blatant propaganda realm to find major differences from one side to the other. It's just, good luck feeling confident with any sort of overall casualty figure. What all that means is that Russia's goal of demilitarizing Ukraine is something we common folks can't effectively measure, which is probably why Russia keeps coming back to that. There's also an aspect of ratios here that matter. If Russia were to destroy 100 Ukrainian vehicles and didn't lose one, then that's a clear win for Russia. But what if those 100 Ukrainian vehicles cost them the same amount? 100 Russian vehicles down. Would Russia still consider that a victory? Now expand that out. 200 Russian vehicles for 100 Ukrainian vehicles. Win or loss? I mean, Russia has more equipment and manpower than Ukraine, so it's possible that a 1-to-1 ratio is acceptable for what they're trying to accomplish, but there is a limit to that. I mean, take it to the extreme, and I find it hard to believe that a 50-to-1 ratio in favor of Ukraine is worth it to Russia. And I don't think that's the case, just throwing out a big number here, to show there has to be a point where the cost isn't worth the benefit. Overall, though, it doesn't really matter. That concept of demilitarization failed long ago. The best interpretation I can come up with of what Russia means with that term is the idea that the two militaries meet on the field of battle, one is destroyed, and the victor then lays out the terms for the nation that now has, no military to defend itself. My mind kind of goes back to medieval times where an entire fighting force could be on the battlefield at once, so it was actually possible to wipe out an entire army in one battle. Once that's done, the country can no longer defend itself and has to come to some sort of terms. Russia may have had a window to do this just after they invaded in February of 2022. The early hours and days of the invasion were pretty heavily focused on military objectives. Not to say there weren't civilian casualties, but the majority of Russian military force was being employed against Ukrainian military targets like airfields, barracks, and air defense sites. That is essentially demilitarization, if you want to dial it in. A war focused on fighting and defeating another nation's military. And it's possible, I'm not going to pretend to speak for the entirety of the Ukrainian population here, but it's possible that if Russia would have maintained that focus, they could have, over time, worn down the Ukrainian military to the point of forcing negotiations on their terms. But not anymore. There was a tipping point. It may have been the Bucha massacre in early March, though details of that didn't really come out until early April. It could have been the bombing of the theater in Mariupol on March 16th, where despite people scrawling the word children in Russian outside the building, it was still attacked. Maybe it was later when residential buildings began to be targeted in drone and missile attacks. It's hard to dial in for sure, but we've definitely passed that line. That line where Russia has taken enough actions against the civilian population that they have no chance for this war to end how they originally imagined. And the U.S. had a similar issue in Iraq after the 2003 invasion. There was a period of time, months, maybe even years, where we had a chance for success there. The initial military operation was successful, and then sometime in the period thereafter, we dropped the ball. I mean, we dropped the ball in a lot of ways, but there was a tipping point in there somewhere. At first, Iraqis were willing to accept some degree of civilian casualties and damage to infrastructure for a chance at a better life. But then we didn't deliver, and all the little mishaps began to build to where it became clear that victory, if attainable at all, would be much, much harder to achieve. And in Ukraine, Russia continues to add to that ledger in the wrong direction, at least in terms of achieving some sort of victory. For a campaign of demilitarization to work, there has to be a critical mass of non-combatants that don't pick up arms themselves. In this case, Russia needs, or needed, the Ukrainian population to be defenseless and unwilling to risk their own lives once the military was eliminated. And back to the U.S.-Iraq example, in the first months after the fall of Baghdad, guerrilla and insurgent attacks were pretty limited, at least compared to what they would be a few years down the road. That was a window where the Iraqis saw what the U.S. was capable of against the Iraqi army and decided it wasn't worth their lives to take up arms. Over time, though, that changed. And before long, even women and kids were finding ways to support their local or regional anti-U.S. group. Back to this war, though, every single apartment building Russia destroys makes the war that much more personal to those specific civilians. Those strikes aren't reducing the Ukrainian will to fight. They're reducing any possible support Russia could have hoped to have once this demilitarization was complete. Think about the recent video of the graphic beheading of a Ukrainian service member while they were still alive. That'll harden Ukrainian resolve now and into the foreseeable future. With every torture and execution video Russia releases, they're actively militarizing Ukraine, the opposite of what they're supposedly going for. There are Ukrainians that will see these acts of terror and sign up to fight or volunteer to assist however they can, and when these awful images reach an international community, it sparks demands across NATO to send more military and economic aid. By shifting their focus away from directly eliminating Ukrainian military forces, Russia has managed to help Ukraine become one of the largest militaries in Europe who's now fielding new NATO technology and equipment. So this special military operation has had the same effect on the Ukrainian military as it has on NATO. Rather than weaken, Russia's actions have made both even stronger. But let's say over the course of the next few months or years, Russia does grind down the Ukrainian military until there's no real fighting force left. For the sake of argument, we'll say Ukraine has no more jets, no more tanks, no more APCs, no more rocket or cannon artillery. The Ukrainian military as a fighting force is no more. Sounds like a Russian success, right? Nope. The way that Russia has waged this war guarantees that if peace is reached tomorrow, there are going to be countless groups and individual citizens ready and willing to punish Russia for what they've done. Punish them for their family members killed during a drone attack while they were asleep in their homes. Punish them for the soldiers tortured, executed, and whose bodies were desecrated, the actions recorded and then cheered on by Russian supporters. There's already a significant Ukrainian resistance operating in Russian-held territory. So far this year, there's been bombings in Melitopol, Mariupol, Zaporozhye, and Kherson. There's no reason to believe that a peace deal reached tomorrow would prevent those from continuing into the future. Russia may have wanted to take on the Ukrainian military, but their actions have organized and galvanized the entire population. And so long as Russia occupies any portion of their country, it's hard to see a scenario where the citizens of Ukraine back down. So even in Russia's best case scenario here, where the total destruction of the Ukrainian armed forces is on track, they've managed to create a potentially even larger problem. As a friend of mine used to say, they stepped on a dollar to pick up a dime. Russia may eventually be able to claim the demilitarization of Ukraine, but that won't be the victory they think it is.